Hello everybody, my name is Robius, and today I present to you the 15th episode in the renewed iteration of Assassin's Creed: The Real History. This video will be part of the sub-series I started a few weeks back, in which I chronologically explore the time periods chosen as the backdrops for the various Assassin's Creed titles, giving you a review of their major historical events, discussing any gaps in the history left by the games, and introducing you to the individuals who actually existed. In that vein, today's episode will be concentrating on the period depicted in the Assassin's Creed 4 DLC turned standalone title, Freedom Cry. For that reason, please be aware of story spoilers throughout the entire video. However, before I begin, I'd like to clarify a few components. When approaching this subject, I was met with a conundrum. Technically speaking, although the events of Freedom Cry are definitely influenced by the struggles of the Maroons during that century, they are not indicative of any set event per se. Instead, it would be more accurate to state that Adewale's story is one that takes inspiration and overall represents elements from various conflicts involving the Maroon movement without necessarily being based on a single one. Since many of the story's elements tie into the later Haitian Revolution, I almost chose that as the topic for this episode. However, upon further evaluation, it didn't necessarily seem like the right decision since that revolt occurred nearly 6 decades after the ending of this game. It was for this reason that I purposefully chose the title of The Maroon Rebellion for this video, as my intention is to first briefly discuss the origins of this movement, then touch on its portrayal in the game, and finally give you a review of its later developments in the following decades. Now that I've explained that, I'd like to properly begin this video by providing you with some background on this period before the start of Freedom Cry in 1735. To start, the Maroons are generally identified as individuals from Africa, or from African descent, that escaped their slavery while living in the Americas, ultimately going on to establish their own autonomous settlements. The term Maroon wasn't limited to any colony in particular, and through much of their initial years, they represented an abundance of independent communities as opposed to a single unified faction. Some of the oldest records have various Maroon settlements being established in the early 1500s within different colonies. For the sake of this video, we will primarily be concentrating on the Maroons who lived within the then French colony of Saint-Domingue. As slaves were continuously imported due to high death rates, the French began to witness increasing levels of resistance throughout the 17th and 18th centuries. As became a pattern for most Maroon communities in the Caribbean, the slaves of Saint-Domingue who succeeded in escaping their imprisonment traditionally sought out isolated and well-hidden areas to establish their settlements. Thereafter, endeavors were usually made to create an agricultural system capable of supporting their people. Evidently, slavers and local military authorities would often make attempts to recapture their escapees or simply wipe out the settlements altogether. Sometimes they would succeed, but in other instances the Maroons would prove themselves too capable. It is said many of these factions demonstrated themselves to be efficient fighters in terms of guerrilla warfare, thus allowing them to protect their continued independence. In fact, certain sizable Maroon communities developed a habit of not only hiding, but also occasionally attacking local plantations and freeing other slaves. This led to a few circumstances in which the regional government would actually sign peace treaties with these settlements, promising to respect their land and independence in exchange for an end to the plantation attacks and a guarantee that any further runaway slaves would be returned to their owners. However, it should be recognized that these treaties frequently fell apart. Throughout these years, a large assortment of these communities would rise and fall as they fought for their independence and liberty. With this general understanding of the Maroons' earlier years, we can now move on to the events of Freedom Cry, which, as I said, were technically fictionalized to a large extent, but do represent an amalgamation of various struggles encountered by the Maroons throughout the period. This game begins its invented narrative with the assassin Adewale pursuing a French Templar target off the coast of Saint-Domingue. After killing the admiral and recovering a valuable package, Adewale's ship sailed into a storm in hopes of escaping the French fleet. Unfortunately, his vessel was wrecked in that storm, and Adewale was washed ashore just outside the town of Port-au-Prince in Saint-Domingue. Once conscious, the assassin began to track down the intended recipient of the package he stole from the Templars. This investigation led him to discover the whereabouts of Bastienne Joseph, who certain sources list historically as being a free woman of color that owned a brothel in that region. Unwilling to immediately trust her, Adewale instead visited a nearby Maroon settlement to confer with its fictional leader, Augustin Dufort, and deliver him a letter from Bastienne. Continuing with this invented plot, Adewale eventually reached the Maroon settlement, but realized that the small community was under attack. Joining the fight, the assassin was able to turn the tide and kill the slavers before they could escape and communicate the location of the Maroons to their allies. Thereafter, Adewale delivered the letter to Augustin, who revealed it was from Pierre, Marquis de Fayet, the governor of Saint-Domingue. The Maroon leader then expressed his disbelief that the letter was part of their continued peace negotiations, which the governor had sent, while also dispatching his men in an attempt to wipe out his distracted adversaries. Now, although the entirety of the plot up until this point was technically fictionalized, it really embodied the type of turmoil experienced by the Maroon communities. As I stated earlier, Augustin's fabricated encampment was a fair representation of real Maroon settlements, as it was hidden in a cave within the jungle, which Adewale only found through the aid of their underground contact network. Furthermore, the negotiations depicted between the governor and the Maroons, in terms of establishing a peace to ultimately decrease the amount of armed conflicts, was also reflective of the actual history, as was its rapid deterioration. Nevertheless, the fictional plot continued by having Adewale temporarily align himself with the Maroons. He then helped them free slaves from imprisonment, thus gathering new combatants while further building their community. Thereafter, the assassin stole a French vessel and used it to successfully intercept an incoming slave ship, thus liberating all of its captives and once again bolstering the Maroons' numbers. As Adewale returned to meet with Bastien, she gave him a task that led to the main historical event featured in the game. On her request, Adewale disguised himself as a slave and infiltrated the grounds of Governor de Fayet's mansion with hopes of discovering what had been keeping him preoccupied as of late. Incidentally, the assassin overheard a conversation between the governor and the French astronomer Louis Godin, as they discussed details concerning the so-called Spanish-French geodesic mission. Still unclear on all the details, Adewale departed, but not before hearing an argument between the men in which de Fayet accused Godin of wasting the expedition's money on one of Bastien's girls at the brothel. Regardless, the scientists still convinced de Fayet to provide further funding after promising that the results of the expedition would ensure that fewer slave ships would be lost on their way to Saint-Domingue. Historically, this argument is recorded as occurring, although certain elements involved were instead brought up by Louis Godin's French contemporaries who were furious that he wasted their money on his adulterous ventures. In the game, after this initial intelligence was gathered, Adewale investigated further, finally coming to understand the full extent of the expedition. Reporting back to Bastien, he explained that the geodesic mission represented a joint scientific venture between Spain and France. Its goal was to determine the roundness of the Earth while comparing the Earth's circumference at its poles to that at the equator. Perceiving this as a unique opportunity for the assassins and the Maroons to gain a potential navigational advantage over their rivals, Adewale made plans to use this expedition to their benefit. This was accomplished in the game by exchanging the 3 slaves who were historically purchased to provide support to the scientists during the expedition with 3 of Adewale's Maroon allies who would join the mission instead and report back on their findings upon its completion. The game also made a few mentions of Godin's intentions to perhaps conduct some smuggling during the expedition and how this idea was complicated by the presence of their Spanish chaperones. In reality, one of these chaperones, who wasn't technically portrayed in this game but did appear elsewhere in the franchise, was the Spanish scientist and later governor of Louisiana, Antonio de Ulloa. Nevertheless, after their successful, albeit fictionalized infiltration of the geodesic mission, Adewale and his Maroon allies were warned by Bastien that their acts of rebellion had translated into harsher conditions for slaves still in captivity, cautioning that the governor threatened further retaliation. However, the Maroons insisted on not losing their momentum, as they felt they were nearing a revolution. Unfortunately, during their next attempt to free a slave ship, when the battle seemed lost to the French, they turned their cannons on the slave ship and sunk it. Although Adewale did try and save as many of the imprisoned as possible, most among them drowned. In the game's final act, Adewale insisted the Maroons never abandon their goal of independence, and then explained that he would kill the governor as punishment for his crimes. Reaching de Fayet's mansion, Adewale interrupted him while he tortured a captured Maroon and proceeded to kill the man. Ultimately, this led the assassin to flee Saint-Domingue, since his notoriety would prove detrimental to the Maroon movement he helped establish and which he hoped to see soon attain its independence. This would represent the end of Assassin's Creed Freedom Cry, with de Fayet's death occurring in July of 1737. As I stated earlier, since the events of Freedom Cry were predominantly a fictional amalgamation of various anecdotal records of the period, Instead of simply ending the video here, I would like to briefly discuss the history following the Assassin's Creed game so that you may have a better idea of how these later stages of rebellion led to the eventual Haitian Revolution decades later. Unfortunately, this does mean that this portion of the video will overlap with other historical periods I intend on covering in upcoming episodes, but for the sake of being thorough, I think it would be worth this minor mix-up. Anyways, historically, although minor rebellions did occur during and preceding the time frame of Freedom Cry, it wasn't until years later that certain Maroon communities escalated the intensity of their counterattacks. The first major example of this would have been the actions of François Macandal, who again wasn't portrayed in the game but did serve as the inspiration for one of his fictionalized students that was depicted elsewhere in the franchise. Thought to have been a voodoo priest, Macandal ascended to the role of leadership among the Maroons of Saint-Domingue and proved himself capable of uniting many of their communities while also creating a large communication network between his various allies and the still imprisoned slaves occupying various plantations. In certain circles, Macandal is considered to have been among the first revolutionary Maroon leaders, as he launched a series of increasingly effective and bloody attacks using guerrilla warfare against the French colonists, freeing their slaves, burning down their plantations, and killing the slavers. In fact, some accounts state that he even coordinated with slaves living on plantations, passing along poison which they could use to kill their owners. Overall, this violent campaign, which had begun in 1751, led to a strong French response in which Macandal was eventually captured in 1758 and thereafter publicly burned at the stake in an attempt to dissuade further rebellion. Nevertheless, armed Maroon resistance continued to a lesser extent despite the loss of their leader. However, the next major shift in the status quo took place in 1789. Following the early onset of the French Revolution and the publication of the Declaration of the Rights of Man, important questions were raised about Saint-Domingue's future. One faction sought independence from France so that the slavers could operate their island without restrictions, whereas the other faction lobbied for the newly established rights of man to be applied to all men, no matter their race. Within the following 2 years, tensions continued to rise with minor outbreaks of fighting, which led to the August 21st, 1791 slave revolt. Under Maroon leadership, the slaves attacked on an unprecedented scale, leading to months of fighting and thousands of deaths between both sides. The provisional French government tried to secure control over Saint-Domingue after they only offered rights to free people of color, but they were held back by the revolutionary slaves who were now supported by Great Britain and Spain. This led the National Convention, under the command of Maximilien de Robespierre, to finally abolish slavery on February 4, 1794, thus providing legal rights to all former slaves. This act led some of the rebel leadership, like Toussaint Louverture, to terminate their alliance with the British and the Spanish and instead align themselves with France, eventually being victorious in ousting these other nations from Saint-Domingue and re-establishing French rule. By 1801, most of the island had come under the command of Louverture, who sought to rule the colony as an autonomous state separate from France. In response to hearing this intention, Napoleon Bonaparte, at this point the first consul of France, dispatched a military expedition with the purpose of re-establishing French rule in Saint-Domingue. Louverture was eventually imprisoned, and although Saint-Domingue entered a period of brief peace, when it became clear that the French under Bonaparte intended on re-establishing slavery, the rebellion once again quickly gained momentum. The next year and a half saw extensive fighting, with multiple French allies defecting to the rebel forces, ultimately leading to a French defeat at the end of 1803. On January 1, 1804, Jean-Jacques Dessalines, the current leader of the rebel forces, declared Saint-Domingue an independent republic and had it renamed Haiti. Although I've evidently skimmed through this very influential period, and there's definitely a ton more to talk about concerning the Haitian Revolution and its aftermath, I feel that for the sake of the video, this brief summary serves as a reasonably condensed explanation of how the earlier Maroon rebellions played a role in leading up to their eventual independence. For that reason, I feel that we can now move on to the final chapter of the video and review everything we've learned today while comparing its depiction in the game to the actual history. To start, given the nature of Freedom Cry as more of a game inspired by decades of historical occurrences, as opposed to a single event or period, I'm going to take a more liberal stance and say that the only component in the game solely rooted in fiction was the Assassin vs. Templar battle for the precursor box. Having said that, please realize that the vast majority of this game was fictionalized. However, in this next section, I intend to break down how its portrayal of a 2-year stretch from 1735 to 1737 was actually heavily influenced by the decades of conflicts that the Maroons faced. When discussing the portions of the game that were inspired by real historical events, the first point which comes to mind is Adewale's joint effort with the Maroons to actively attack plantations with the goal of freeing other slaves to build their community. Although this was a far less common occurrence during the game's time period, one need only look at the later actions of Macandal to see that a more offensive approach was eventually adopted by certain Maroons who decided to retaliate instead of hiding and simply trying to survive. When looking at the fictional Augustin Dieufort, it's easy to see how he was written in a way that took inspiration from future Maroon leaders who would fight for the independence of their people decades later. The next point was the use of a vessel to intercept incoming slave ships with the goal of freeing their captives. Although it only occurred after they had attained their independence, there are records of Haitian vessels being used to ambush and seize foreign slave ships, ultimately liberating the individuals within. Next, we can talk about the French response to the increased Maroon activity. Although I had trouble finding any example in which they purposefully sunk a slave ship, what I did find were many parallels with the game in terms of the slavers increasing the punishment and the abusive conditions towards their slaves in an attempt to dissuade further rebellion in such periods of revolt. Lastly, the final component of the story in which Ubisoft manipulated the recorded history to fit the game's story was Governor de Fayet's death. Although he is recorded as dying in 1737, I was hard-pressed to find any details related to his cause of death, thus leaving it open for the writers to fill the gap by having Adewale kill him. Taking all of this information into consideration, we can now contemplate whether this period of Maroon rebellion was fairly depicted in Assassin's Creed Freedom Cry. As I've stated multiple times, despite it not technically being a realistic depiction of a revolutionary Maroon movement occurring from 1735 to 1737, when looking at it as a representation of the decades of struggle to come, I personally believe that Freedom Cry gave players a rather authentic look at the brutality of slavery in the period and the people who would come to fight against it. The portrayal of the hidden Maroon communities, the failed attempts to negotiate peace agreements with the colonists, and the subsequent retaliatory raids on plantations as part of the larger battle for independence and freedom were all parts of the compressed story which truly summarized, to a small extent, the evolution of this movement over the decades that followed. By simply looking at how close Adewale felt the revolution was coming in 1737, when in reality it wouldn't technically begin until 1791, it gives players a brief glimpse of how long and drawn out this process was, as it took strong leaders and a specific set of circumstances to finally light the revolutionary fuse. As a final note, I'd also like to quickly add that the inclusion of the Spanish-French geodesic mission as the main historical event in the story was interesting, because although in reality it didn't tie into the Maroon struggle at all, the game portrayed many of its components in a rather accurate manner. Nevertheless, with that final thought, we have reached the end of today's video. If you enjoyed the content, please share this series with your friends and be sure to explore our other episodes. For now, I intend to continue covering the franchise's time periods, but feel free to leave me your topic requests for a future video in the comments. As always, my sources used for making this video will be in the description bar below. Thank you for watching.